Seems like almost every day there's a new story in the news about a pastor who had some kind of moral failing. How in the world does that keep happening? Let's talk about it. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another video on this channel. My name is Chase, and if you're new to this channel, I am a pastor, specifically a church planter. And whether you're a pastor, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, the reality is that it's not uncommon to see pastors have moral failures. So I think it was just over the summer I made a video of a famous pastor who was being interviewed by a famous YouTuber, Logan Paul. And that pastor since had a moral failure. And then over the last couple weeks, more and more information has been coming out about another high profile leader. Really, regardless of when you're watching this video, the sad thing is that it probably won't be too far removed from some big name pastor having had some sort of moral failure. This most recent one, which I'm not going to get into all the details about that, but this most recent one was probably the most shocking one to me because of the man who had fallen had such a powerful impact on my life and my faith. But really, whenever this happens, whether it's someone who I look up to, whether it's someone who I've barely heard of, the question that always pops in my mind and the question that I've always seen being asked is how did this happen? How can someone who claims to have lived a life where the sole purpose of their life is to bring other people to God be living such a duplicitous lifestyle that shows that they weren't even walking close with God? The purpose of this video isn't to get into all of the examples of when all of this happened, but I wanted to share something that has been the biggest eye-opener to me as a pastor, as a young pastor, to trying to make sure that my life doesn't end up going down that same path. I have the privilege of being a pastor at a church that has several different campuses, and so our senior pastor, who's the senior pastor over all of the campuses, had all of us campus pastors, we all read this book called Glorious Finish. It's by Daniel Henderson. If you are a pastor, if you are a church planter, if you are someone in ministry, this is like top of the list of must reads. The subtitle is Keeping Your Eye on the Prize of Eternity in a Time of Pastoral Failings. It's by a man named Daniel Henderson who has had the tough task of pastoring two large churches after the pastor had some sort of failure. I think that's got to be probably the hardest job in ministry. Not just to follow some pastor at a large church, which is always difficult, but to follow some pastor who just had a moral failure because then the whole congregation's skeptical of you. Anyway, that's not the point of this video. But I just want to quickly give this diagram that Daniel Henderson gives at the beginning of this book because, again, it was eye-opening to me. And hopefully, if there's any young church leaders out there watching this right now, young or old, this can be helpful to you to make sure that we don't go down the path that we're seeing so many of these leaders go down, and so that kind of as this is the premise of this book, so that our lives will result in a glorious finish. I'm going to put a link in the comments to this book right here because it's a book that you all should definitely read. So in this book, Daniel Henderson, he gives this diagram where he gives 7 different attributes that leaders who fall have, and basically they kind of are sequential, like one leads to the other. And before he gives those 7 reasons, he starts by saying that our reason for being in ministry is one of the indicators for whether our life is gonna result in a glorious finish or whether we're gonna go down some path that we shouldn't. And so that's the first question that we should be asking as leaders. Why are we doing this? Like, are we in ministry to try and be famous? Are we in ministry to try and make money? Probably not, because you're not gonna make a lot of money being in ministry. Are we trying to make people laugh? Are we like what is our why for being ministers of the gospel? And if it's anything other than to share the good news of Jesus, we're in it for the wrong reason. I'm not saying the pastor shouldn't make any money, pastor shouldn't make anybody laugh. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to evaluate what is the main driving motivation behind what we're doing. If everything else was stripped away, why would we be doing this? That's the first thing we need to ask. But then he goes to this diagram of 7 characteristics that fallen leaders have. The first one is neglect. Right? Like neglecting our devotional life, neglecting our time alone in the Word. And it's so easy to neglect that because there's so much other stuff that we can be doing, right? I got a video hopefully coming out pretty soon about what all I've been doing trying to plant this church and all the logistical and time management problems that have come up with that for me. And so it's easy to fall into that neglect, but that neglect is the first step that leads down this slippery slope. And the next thing is self-reliance. They're kind of tied one and the same, right? If we're neglecting our time with God, then that means that that we're relying more on ourselves than depending on God. The next one is professionalism. It's so easy for us as pastors, as people in ministry, to start to think of this as just a profession. But pastoring is so much more than just a profession. And so it's so important for us to realize that, or else we can just get so lost in like the strategies and the business aspect of the church or whatever ministry. And I'm not saying that we should neglect that, but if the business side of things surpasses our focus on what our primary calling is, that's a problem. Which, I mean, really all of these are tied together. Neglect, self-reliance, professionalism. The next thing is entitlement, right? Thinking that we deserve something. This was huge in the last scandal to break with it's even painful to say his name, but Ravi Zacharias, as there was just all these reports of how he would guilt the women into doing what he was doing. And one of the things that he seemed to be saying was almost this attitude of entitlement. Like, I do so much for God, this is what I deserve over here, right? It's wicked. It's an evil way of thinking, but that way of thinking doesn't just come out of the blue, right? It ties all the way back to a neglect with personal time with the Lord. These things build on each other. The next thing is compartmentalization. These people that live two lives are able to completely compartmentalize, where this is your church life over here, this is your whatever it might be. These pastors that have these failings are able to compartmentalize and live these duplicitous lives. The last two are dissatisfaction, right? You're no longer satisfied in just preaching the gospel. You need all this other stuff to add meaning to your life or add fulfillment to your life. And then the last thing is dishonorable discharge, which is essentially when everything blows up and falls apart. Quickly, Daniel Henderson in this book, he gives kind of not necessarily the antidote, but the opposite, I guess, of all of these characteristics. And so the opposite of neglect, he says, is worship. And so are we living lives that are really rooted in worship? I made a video in the fall about what is worship. Humility, right? Like a lack of self-reliance is a dependence on God, which should lead to an attitude and a heart of humility. Authenticity, right? Are we trying to be professionals or are we trying to be authentic? Like, that's such a fine line to walk. And this is probably a topic for another video. You know, as pastors, especially as church planters, like, we want things to be real. We want things to be authentic. We don't want to just put on a face, but at the same time, we want to do things well. And so that balance of professionalism and authenticity, I think, is a struggle. But I think it's so important that our authenticity exceeds our desire to just be professionals. Integrity, right? That's kind of the opposite of compartmentalization. I forget who said it, that who you are is who you are when no one's watching. And so if we're going to live lives of integrity, then who we are in public needs to also be who we are in private. In the last two, joyful hope, and then ultimately that leads to a glorious finish, which ultimately isn't even just talking about here on earth, but ultimately in heaven. This is tough to talk about. I think part of the reason it's tough for us to talk about as pastors is because all of us are still messed up people. All of us have things in our life that we don't want people to find out. All of us have things that we're not proud of and things that we're ashamed of. I think it was Scottish minister Robert Murray McShane who said, I have discovered that the seed of every evil sin lies within my heart, right? And he's someone, side note, who died at my age in a pandemic. I always think about that when I think of him lately. But this is so difficult for us to talk about, which is why I think the other aspect of this book that is just so helpful is that Daniel Henderson emphasizes that one of the things that keeps us in the right column is what he calls our rhythms, right? Not just our reasons for why we're doing this, but our rhythms. Like, are we staying grounded with accountability partners? Do we have people who truly know us and know all of the dark spots in our lives? Are we praying regularly? Are we spending time in the Word? Are we fasting? Like, all of that stuff is so important for us as pastors, specifically young pastors. And so anyway, I could drag on and talk so much more about this, but I just wanted to make this video because I think when pastors fall, it's almost like there's some people who just delight in seeing pastors fall, and there will always be that. But one of the questions that I'm often left with, and I see so many people reeling with, is just the why. Like, how does this happen? And so I think this book was really helpful for me, having read this in the fall, to process more recent events and ultimately try and keep myself out of the category that leads to a dishonorable discharge, and hopefully in the category that leads to a glorious finish. If you're watching this and you're not a pastor and you watch this long, or not someone in ministry, really, if you're a Christian, all Christians are called to ministry. But if you're watching this and you're not a pastor, let me just add, pray for your pastor. Pastoral ministry is difficult. Like I said, I've only been doing this for 6 or 7 months, but I've been doing it long enough to know that it's difficult. And so pray for your pastor. And again, if you are a pastor, I can't recommend this book enough. Glorious Finish. I'm going to link to it in the description. And may we all, pastor or non-pastor, strive to live lives that result in a glorious finish. Thanks for watching this video. So glad to be doing YouTube again. If you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button. That just lets YouTube know that you enjoy this content so that it can recommend it to others. And as always, I'll see you on another video.